A bit of a different video for me today, where I go back in time and look at some of the failed transfers at Spurs, where if they'd just been a bit more decisive and paid a bit extra money, things could have worked out very differently. Now, this isn't an exhaustive list of missed transfer targets, and there will no doubt be some I've missed, but this video is more to highlight the pattern of failure over the years that, had it been handled differently, it could have rewritten the history books. So a bit different from me today, but here are your daily Tottenham news headlines. Hello, welcome back to the channel. My name's Craig and here are your daily Tottenham news headlines, but I'll be going through all the latest news, rumours and reports. If you're watching on YouTube and are not already yet subscribed to the channel, please consider doing so. Like, share and comment below. And if you're listening on an audio platform, please do hit that follow button and leave a review if you can. Okay, let's get into it. As I say, a slightly different video for me today, detailing a few of Spurs' nearly men, 6 years of caution at least, and compromise and costly restraint, and how Tottenham repeatedly chose value over vision and paid the price. For Tottenham supporters, the last 6 years have not been defined by ignorance in the transfer market, but by something more frustrating: recognition without conviction that Spurs have repeatedly identified elite or soon-to-be elite players engaged in negotiations, briefly interested, and then stepped back when decisive spending was required. What followed, time and time again, was a pivot to cheap alternatives, loans or high upside gambles. Some worked briefly, many didn't, and the cumulative effect has been a squad that rarely lacked talent but consistently lacked difference makers. Tottenham's Champions League final appearance in June 2019 should have marked a moment of aggressive renewal. Mauricio Pochettino said the squad needed painful decisions. Instead, Spurs made expensive but uncertain ones. Spurs were strongly linked, of course, with Bruno Fernandes throughout the summer in 2019. Sporting wanted a premium fee, but Tottenham hesitated. Manchester United, of course, didn't, and Fernandes immediately became the most productive midfielder in the Premier League. Goals, assists, leadership, eventually a captain. United's trajectory shifted. Who was signed instead for Spurs? Well, Tanguy and Ndombele for a club record fee. Talent unquestionable. Suitability is questionable, and struggled with fitness, of course, intensity, tactical discipline, and ultimately was loaned out. Giovanni Lo Celso, creative flashes, but persistent injuries and inconsistency prevented him from becoming Eriksen's successor. Jack Clarke, a £10 million one for the future from Leeds, immediately loaned back and then lost in a cycle of loans, confidence decline and eventual sale. Fernandes was ready-made authority, and Spurs chose potential and paid the price. Even before 2019, Spurs had already shown the same instinct in Jack Grealish. Spurs identified a Premier League-ready creative talisman when he was still at Villa. The offer was reportedly £5 million plus Josh Onoma, and it was rejected. Of course it was. Spurs walked away rather than value and match Villa's valuation of the player. Grealish, of course, went on as a £100 million player and became part of Pep Guardiola's system. Spurs' approach, what was it? Well, continue recycling through midfielders without ever securing creative talent. By 2020, Tottenham's transfer strategy leaned heavily on temporary solutions. The brilliant exception to all of these was, of course, Gareth Bale's homecoming. Bale's return on loan from Real Madrid was a rare success. For a spell, Spurs fans glimpsed what elite quality looks like. Goals from nothing, personality and belief. Bale delivered decisive moments and reminded everyone of the club's ceiling when genuine stars were involved. But it was fleeting, of course. Bale was not a long-term solution, and Spurs did not replace him with anyone. So what are a few of the other gambles that failed? Well, Carlos Vinicius, he was signed to deputise for Harry Kane, limited impact, minimal trust in the player from managers, and no lasting value. Gedson Fernandes, loaned as a midfield solution without a clear role, rarely used, and he quietly returned. They were not low-risk master strokes. They were placeholders, and they left Spurs structurally weaker once their loans ended. Believe it or not, a young Erling Haaland was admired and watched by Spurs, and there were many links to the player in 2020. As Haaland exploded onto the European scene, Spurs were again mentioned among clubs that were interested. The cost, of course, was steep, release clauses and agents' fees with wages, etc., but Spurs declined to engage at that level. Haaland went to Dortmund and then to Man City, where he shattered records and powered title-winning sides with Man City. Tottenham, meanwhile, later spent big on Richarlison. We all know about Richarlison, not remotely transformational and certainly not good enough to challenge Harry Kane. The gap between a good signing and an era-defining signing was never clearer. Spurs also tracked Declan Rice for years. Internally, he was seen as a leader, a stabiliser, a player who could anchor the midfield through multiple managers. But when the moment came, Spurs balked and Arsenal didn't. Rice became the centrepiece of Arteta's midfield, of course, durable, dominant, decisive. Spurs instead assembled combinations of Højbjerg, Bentancur, Bissouma, all useful players, absolutely, but none of them defining like Rice became. The most recent case, of course, depressingly familiar. Spurs looking to sign Eberechi Eze, believing the deal was there to be done. Arsenal accelerated, paid decisively and completed the signing. Spurs pivoted again. Talented alternatives, but not Eze. Another rival strengthened when a Spurs player had already identified as ideal. The issue is not scouting. Spurs routinely identify the right players. The issue is decisiveness. Tottenham Hotspur are financially responsible, intelligently run, as we all know, but rarely reckless. But elite football is not won by balance sheets alone. It's won by moments when clubs choose conviction over caution. The last 6 years showed that Spurs repeatedly stepped back at precisely the moment boldness was required. In doing so, they surrendered not just players, but momentum, authority and belief. Gareth Bale's 2020 return proved the point better than any spreadsheet could. When genuine elite quality walks through the door, everything feels different. Spurs have spent years chasing that feeling again without ever quite being willing to pay for it. And it goes back far longer than 2019. On 7th of July 1994, Spurs announced the signing of Jurgen Klinsmann from AS Monaco for about £2 million, a player at the time who was unquestionably one of the world's best. Since then, the narrative of Spurs' transfer market has not been one of buying established global superstars at their peak. Instead, the club, and above all, Daniel Levy, has repeatedly pursued bargains, prospects and value deals, producing a long list of high-profile near misses and failed pursuits. The result, memorable homegrown coups and smart scouting, but very few headline grabbers who arrived already at the absolute summit of world football. When Jurgen Klinsmann arrived at White Hart Lane, he was not a developing talent or a speculative buy. He was already a world-class striker, a proven international and household name across Europe. He made an immediate impact in 1994, winning the Football Writers Association award that year and embedding himself in Spurs folklore. That signing, a marquee name already at the top of his game, is routinely contrasted with almost every marquee transfer as Tottenham since pursued. It could be argued that Klinsmann was in fact the last world-class signing Spurs have made. So who are some of the other big names Spurs have courted over the years but ultimately missed out on? Well, just a few to prove the point. Rivaldo, 2002, reported interest in a free transfer opportunity when Barcelona were offloading players. The move never happened and Rivaldo went elsewhere. Spurs' willingness to court an out-of-contract star shows intent, but not the final payoff. Willian, of course, 2013, Andre Villas-Boas reportedly saw Willian as a natural replacement for Bale. Spurs reached the point of a medical before the player, of course, went to Chelsea at the last moment. Coutinho, around the same time, Spurs reportedly agreed terms and pressed until deadline, but it could not be completed, the deal with the player, and he went to Porto, another near miss. Eden Hazard, of course, Hazard said Spurs expressed interest, but his decision ultimately went the other way. Spurs failed to convert links into a signature. Damião, of course, a long-running saga that never concluded despite multiple windows of reported interest. Sadio Mane, Poch, reportedly wanted Mane, but Spurs balked at the fee and wage demands and did not complete the deal again. And of course, we know Mane went on to become a world-class player elsewhere. Kaka, media reports fleetingly linked Kaka in windows when Spurs chased headline names. Nothing substantive on this one materialised, but Spurs again would not spend the money. Across the 2000s into the mid-2010s, Tottenham's recruitment profile shifted toward one or a combination of the following sort of strategies: sign young or undervalued players or foreign players not yet proven in England, and then develop them into stars. Luka Modric's emergence after his move to Spurs. This model reduces upfront risk, of course, and can generate handsome resale on performance returns. But Spurs have always hunted bargains or chase out contract stars or players who clubs were believed to be negotiable. Ronaldo, for example, was also linked, as I say. These moves were attempted, but the price tag wasn't met. Daniel Levy's reputation for driving hard bargains and sticking to valuations meant Spurs often pulled it out when the price and wage demands exceeded thresholds. Levy has publicly defended the club's transfer policy and argued the club won't overpay. That negotiating stance has created both praise for financial prudence and criticism for lost opportunities. This approach explains why Spurs developed a reputation for almost signing global stars. Big names were linked, of course, pursued and sometimes to late stages, yet we rarely paid the market-leading fees needed to secure the signature of world-class players. Instead, the club invested in scouting, coaching and the occasional smart purchase of a talent on the rise. Spurs' strategy produced undeniable positives, but the club identified profited from signings who blossomed in N17 and later elsewhere. And in the modern era of ballooning transfer fees that can cripple clubs financially, a degree of prudence is defensible. On the other hand, the serial near misses and high-profile failed pursuits have left supporters wondering what might have been, and the club chose to spend freely on already established superstars instead of chasing value. The Klinsmann benchmark keeps returning in these debates precisely because he arrived already as a global star at the top of his game, something that Spurs didn't replicate in the same way again. Arguably, and I will say this again, the last signing who arrived at White Hart Lane, already widely accepted as a world-class player at the peak of his powers, was Jurgen Klinsmann in 1994. Since then, Spurs' transfer strategy has been defined by thrift scouting and the pursuit of upside rather than the purchase of established megastars, perhaps Van der Vaart aside, but you know what I mean. The strategy brought moments of genius, notably homegrown stars or developed stars and prolonged Champions League competitiveness, but also created an archive of near misses and a running conversation about ambition versus prudence. The Klinsmann comparison remains useful because precisely it does ask the question, does the club want to win now by buying the very best or build sustainably, finding the next best thing? We all wanted Spurs, of course, to build on that Europa League triumph in May and use it as a springboard to better things. If the Lewis family really want to show ambition, that they say they do, then established Premier League ready now players simply must come through the doors of Hotspur Way in January, regardless of how difficult the winter transfer window is said to be. The manager needs help, the club is fractured, and the owners now really need to put their money where their mouth is and act like a big club, because if they don't, Spurs stand still. There will be no European football again next season for a club that values it above all else. Quite simply, the board need to act, and act now, be decisive and show the rest of the Premier League that Spurs really do mean business this time.